Welcome to our literature talk series Gegenüber Talk presented by the Goethe-Institut North America. My name is Karin Oehlenschläger and I'm the program curator for literature at the Goethe-Institut Boston. Welcome Julia Cumes and Roy Grundmann. Roy is joining us from Boston and Julia is joining us from Cape Cod. We're really delighted to have you with us. Gegenüber is our digital transatlantic magazine, and this event is part of our series Literature Across Borders. Please stay tuned and check our website for further discussions coming up later this year. Today, we are talking about displacement, migration, and belonging across eras and continents with two maybe unexpected experts, film scholar Roy Grundmann and photographer Julia Cumes. Roy Grundmann is the author of the recently published On Shoreless Sea, the MS St. Louis Refugee Ship in History, Film, and Popular Memory. He teaches film studies at Boston University and has curated retrospectives on Andy Warhol, Matthias Müller, and Michael Haneke. His latest interest has turned to sea travel and seaborne migration and how ships have shaped cultural concepts about migration, encampment, decolonization, and tourism. Julia Cumes is a photographer and visual storyteller whose work explores identity, migration, and belonging across across cultures and places. Born in apartheid-era South Africa, she is now based on Cape Cod. Her ongoing project, Invisible Threads, Portraits and Stories of Our Global Neighbors, focuses on the lives of immigrants on Cape Cod. Currently, she is a Boston University Community Impact Fellow. Again, welcome to both of you. We're really delighted that you're joining us and we're looking forward to your conversation.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, Roy.
Hi, Julia.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to be in conversation with Roy about these very topical subject matter. And I think we're going to start by sharing a little bit about our work and actually sharing some images from our work to give you some context for this conversation. So Roy, should I go first?
Yeah, go
Okay,
ahead.
sounds good. So as Karen mentioned in the introduction, I've been working on a project, Invisible Threads, a long-term project here on Cape Cod with my Brazilian creative collaborator, Lipe Borges. And it's centered on people who've migrated from other places and have made their new home here on Cape Cod. These photographs are very collaborative. They're based on long interviews with each of the subjects, getting a lot of historical information, asking them very specific questions, and then talking with them about how they want their story to be told visually. So each photograph is really almost like a tableau, almost like a movie set. And I think of photographs, these particular photographs, less as sort of answers and more as invitations to the viewers to look longer, to kind of question assumptions, and to stay with the complexity of people's lives rather than try to categorize or make assumptions. So I thought I would start off just by sharing some of the work. Um, oops, 1 minute. Okay. Well, I hope everyone can see this image. Just for Roy, can you see an image on the
Yes.
screen? Okay.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, this portrait project tells, the story of people who've made their lives on Cape Cod. Cape Cod has a very global economy. At the moment, we're very dependent on sorry, not a global economy, rather, we're very dependent on our global community to fill jobs in a tourist economy. And what prompted this project was not just my own interest in these stories that, from around the world here on the Cape, but the sort of lack of visibility of our global community, and the lack of really understanding about where people are coming from. So this particular family, so for each of these photos, there's like a central person, and then they chose who they wanted to be photographed with. So for this photograph, it was Tony, who you see on the left there with his family, Joel and daughters. He's from the Democratic Republic of Congo and was a photojournalist covering war crimes. And because of his coverage of war crimes, he was actually captured and tortured by the government and was luckily able to escape and managed to come to the US on a trip with the UN and then defected and sought asylum. And it took him another 4 years to be able to bring Joelle, his wife, over, and then another 2 years after that to bring his older daughter, Hope, the taller girl in the photograph. And so when I interviewed them and asked them how they wanted to be photographed, they talked about they had just had this new little baby who was the first American citizen amongst them. And they really wanted their photograph to be about the family centered on this infant, this new hope in their lives. Um, so, for this particular photograph, the clothing, we talked about clothing and the message they wanted to send with color. The cool blue of the background sort of is supposed to sort of connote his experience with imprisonment. Their warm clothing was about the connection between them, and the obviously the gestures are about connection and intimacy and care. Um, the photographs on the walls even were placed. They're centered on the kid, on their daughter, Faith, the baby. Yeah, the baby's name is Faith, because of what she represented for them. So there was a lot of agency in this photograph and a lot of thought put into every aspect of it. And it was as much, obviously I was the photographer and my partner, and I set up a lot of lights and give a lot of thought to all the details, but there was an absolute collaboration between us to make sure that the story accurately represented them. Whoops. Next. Oops, sorry. Okay. This is Akala, who is from Afghanistan. She grew up when, getting an education. She went to university. And then when the Islamic regime came into power, she was unable to, she had three daughters at the time, and she was unable to give them an education because the government didn't allow young girls to go to school. So she and her husband, this is, a while ago, so she and her husband escaped through the mountains to Afghanistan with their three young daughters, so that they could get an education. So she ended up coming to the Cape because her husband had a connection here on the Cape and got sponsorship. And this is her now with her two young granddaughters. Um, Again, there's a lot of narrative detail in this photograph that was sort of chosen by her. This is in her. She's a seamstress, and she wanted to be photographed in this place that has empowered her economically. She repairs wedding dresses and, basically takes whatever work she can. And her three daughters now are a university professor, a doctor, and a lawyer. So they've really, sort of had an extraordinary, success academically. And in this photograph, you can see on the left here, there's an old photograph of her when she was in Afghanistan. You can see a lot of the sewing materials. There's a little mirror on the far left there. I'm not sure, I don't have, my pointer seems not to be working, but on the far left there you can see her face reflected in a little mirror that she actually uses to watch the television behind her when she's sewing, so that her customers don't necessarily know that she's watching TV while sewing. I just love that detail. And then you could see all her there. These photographs, by the way, when they're exhibited at the museum, they're really large. They're almost life-sized. So you can see a lot more of the narrative detail. You can see actually in the behind her, to the left of her one granddaughter, is actually the clothes that her daughters were wearing when they came through the mountains as young girls. I think they were 3, 6, and 9 at the time. So again, there was a lot of discussion of how she wanted to be represented, the connection between her granddaughters and herself. Sorry, I'm having a hard time. Ah. Oh, sorry. Um, so this is Kennard. He's from Jamaica, and here he's being photographed in his studio. He's actually a fashion designer. During the pandemic, he, was really struggling to kind of find his way, and his sister had a sewing machine in their basement, and he just started playing around with it and just absolutely fell in love with the idea of making clothes. And he comes from this Jamaican background where, there was a lot of color and bold patterns and fabrics, and he just fell in love with that idea of creating a fashion that reflected his own kind of cultural background. He also, in this photograph, talked about wanting to include some reference to his faith. So we actually projected that window using an optical lens in the background. You can see that kind of church window in the background. And then a lot of the other narrative detail just captures his studio space. And every time we did one of these photographs, we spent a lot of time talking about color and what colors people, what resonate with people color-wise. And Kennard just loved, he really wanted those kind of bold, like primary colors, the blues, the reds and the yellows. Um, so, that just gives you a little sense of the choices that he made for this photograph. This is Ling Long, who is from Malaysia, and he's Chinese Malaysian. He came to the United States sort of seeking economic opportunity and was working as in kitchens across the US, was really struggling to find his place. Ended up going back to Malaysia and for his father's funeral, and at his father's funeral met his childhood crush, who he, as you see on the left there, who's now his wife. And he moved back to Malaysia to be with her. And then when she got pregnant, they decided to come to the US to give their daughter the opportunities that they didn't have growing up. And so you can see there she is in the middle, sort of the center of the family. They really wanted that her placement to be sort of central in this photograph. They have a sushi franchise here on the Cape. And hence the addition of the sushi making, details. There's also some references to their Chinese culture, the clothing that they're wearing, and his chef outfit, and then the colors as well. So again, just a lot of, narrative detail. Sorry, I don't know why. I don't know why the slideshow's not. Oh, there it is. Okay. Sorry about that. This is Wilcie. She is Haitian, and she and her mother sit on the right there, and her granddaughter, um, you can see her spinning in her beautiful dress. And she really wanted her photograph to capture the weight of Haiti's history and her and her mother's experience in Haiti. She came to the United States really because her father asked her to come and help support her family, her extended family. There were a lot of family members. They were really struggling economically. So she came to this country to help support them. And
One of my favorites.
oh, thank you, Roy. And what was so delightful in this photograph, we were really kind of trying to figure out how to capture what she wanted to say, which was that, she sees the lightness in her grandchildren in a way that she didn't feel growing up. And perfectly enough, her little granddaughter came down the stairs, Janela, and she did this beautiful spin in her dress. And as soon as she spun, it just struck me like this would be such a wonderful way to capture that contrast. So, that's the choice of her spinning. We ended up having to make her spin many times. And by the end, she actually was like, I can't spin anymore. I'm done. Um, but the connection between her and her mom is really powerful. And I love their closeness in this image and their hands intertwined. I'm sorry, I don't know why there. Okay, there it is. Okay, this is Michael. He is from Costa Rica and he grew up incredibly poor. He literally lived in a lean-to with his mother and four siblings. And they didn't have running water, they didn't have electricity. They struggled so much that his mother ended up at one point selling drugs and then ended up getting caught and sent to jail. And he was in the sixth grade at the time. So he ended up dropping out of school in order to fish, to work on fishing boats to help support his siblings. And happened to, later on meet he was a surfer and he met his now wife, who is from the Cape and who was there on vacation surfing. And they started this relationship, and she brought him over on a fiance visa, and now they have this pet care business together. You can see their little chameleon Rosita, um, and their two dogs in the background and cat, and they have this really successful pet care business on the Cape, and they live in this beautiful home. And the contrast between the story that he told about his childhood and the house that he now lives in with his wife and the life that they've sort of built together is just really striking. And of course, this photo was very challenging to make with all the animals and all the lights that we set up, and trying to keep everybody, trying to sort of compose it in such a way that everybody was kind of looking at the camera, and took a lot of, I think, by the way, each one of these photographs took about 4 to 5 hours. So they're not quick snapshots, nor are they sort of photojournalistic. They're, very sort of intentional, storytelling tableaus. Um, so I'll just do one more and then we can move on. There's many more of these, and it's an ongoing series that will be exhibited again this coming fall and is actually going to be in a book. But you can explore more there. I think that Karen was going to share a link to the more extended project, and the project is currently still growing. But I'll just end on this one. This is Eugene. He's from Belarus, and he was growing up at a time of political oppression, as well as, he's gay, and in Belarus, it was dangerous to be out about your sexuality as a gay person. And he decided to come to the US. He actually came on a J1 visa and was looking for a place that might be a suitable place for him. And he saw some sort of mocking comments from other Belarusian J1 students who had commented on Provincetown being, the gay town. And as soon as he saw that commentary, he was like, that's where I need to go. And so he went there and just absolutely connected with the community. It's a very, very welcoming and progressive community. Um, and just fell in love with the Cape and with Provincetown. Actually became an arborist. So for his photograph, he wanted to be photographed with his favorite tree on the Cape, which is a weeping English beech tree, and his dog Tulsa. And he is in a really empowered place in his life. He's made this career for himself and has really found a community that he connects with. So I just really love, I love this photograph for the story it tells about him, and he looks empowered and comfortable. So I'm going to kind of stop it at that point and let Roy share a little bit of his images so that we can talk about, some of the things that we're interested in sharing. Let's see. Stop share. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. As you know, I'm a big fan of all these images. I think they're so intriguing, and it's been so incredible for me to find keep finding common ground with your project, even though mine is historical, it's different. My project, to just give a quick overview, is a research project. It's a book about the MS St. Louis Refugee Ship. The St. Louis was a German ocean liner that left Germany, Nazi Germany, in 1939 in May with over 900 Jewish migrants on their way to Cuba. And they all had entry visas for Cuba. Many of them didn't want to stay there, but intended to move on to the United States. They already had immigration numbers, which hadn't come due yet, but were supposed to come due within the next few years. So Cuba was kind of a holding station for a lot of them, and there were a lot of refugees in Cuba at the time. When the ship arrived in Cuba, the Cuban government invalidated the visas. There was a lot of political intrigue behind it. And the ship, after a week of negotiations, was forced to leave. So the Cuban government literally kicked them out and told them they had to go. The ship had to leave the harbor, but they would continue to negotiate with them. And the captain was hoping to land the passengers in Florida, and that didn't work out. There was a Coast Guard cutter that chased the St. Louis away. And after crisscrossing the Caribbean for a while, the St. Louis just had no other choice but to go back to Europe. And the passengers were incredibly distraught. They threatened mass suicide and already saw themselves being put in concentration camps upon returning to Nazi Germany. Fortunately, last minute, the Jewish refugee organization, JDC, negotiated asylum with 4 European countries that agreed to take on the passengers. And so the St. Louis received permission to dock in Antwerp, and the passengers were distributed to these 4 countries. One of them was England. The other 3 were in Europe, in continental Europe, Belgium, France, and Holland. And the problem was that just a year later, when the German army invaded those countries, a lot of the passengers were still arrested by the SS. And of the over 900 passengers that had already been in Havana Harbor and had seen the coast of Miami and Florida with their own eyes, of those, 254 still were murdered in concentration camps. So that is the story. And let me share the screen now to talk a little bit about the images here. So here we have the St. Louis, and this is actually a picture I got from a BU colleague of mine, Michael Zell, who is a big ocean liner aficionado, just like I am. I came to this project as both a film historian and that's sort of my official calling, but also as a personal ocean liner aficionado. And I was working on a much larger book about ocean liners in film and literature and popular culture. And the St. Louis was supposed to be one chapter. And I went to Hamburg and found so much research that hadn't been turned up that I decided to get a separate book contract and just write a book about the St. Louis first, which fortunately now came out. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about here is that what is really interesting about, I think where our work converges, Julia, is how migration is really so incredibly complex because the stories are so varied. There are so many individual stories, and the stories are diverse and complex. And that is something that is happening that I see in your photographs, but I also see that in the photos that I've turned up. So, for instance, I go to this image. This is after the St. Louis arrived in Antwerp, and what we see here is the man in the middle with a tie. That is Morris Troper, who is one of the key figures in the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee organization, and he negotiated asylum with the St. Louis for the St. Louis Jews in Europe. And we see his wife with a hat, And they're surrounded by St. Louis passengers. And you see, what I love about this image is that it actually conveys the diversity of the passengers outwardly, visually, in a much better way than a lot of other images do. One of the problems is that the St. Louis passengers were always homogenized. Just like Jews in general are always homogenized as one group, which is already, I think, a sign of anti-Semitism. But what we see here is we see different skin colors, we see different ethnicities, we see different how people dress differently. There was a real spectrum of classes that passengers came from. Passengers did not just come from Germany, but from several European countries, several Eastern European countries. Some of them had entry visas, immigration visas to the US, others did not. Some of them, especially a lot of the young men, had already been in concentration camps following the November 9th pogrom. And so there was also a spectrum of personal mental predispositions on the ship. And I think it's really important to point out that there is always diversity within migration. Refugees are often reduced to this homogeneous uh, uh, impression of being just simply distraught and being all the same and feeling all the same. Well, far from it. And that was certainly the case with the St. Louis passengers, that there was so much diversity among them. One of the other things that I find really inspiring about your work is this tension between invisibility and visibility, and how your project tries to make individuals visible as human beings, as dignified people, as migrants, as people with agency. And that was something that I was trying to trace in my research also. One of the ironies about the St. Louis is that it's one of the actually better known chapters of Holocaust history when it comes to migration. The St. Louis was a prominent ocean liner, and the journey, when it turned into this dramatic voyage, was covered by the press, by the American press, not so much by the German press, though. I found a lot of research that consolidated my view that the German press did not try to instrumentalize the rejection of the passengers as a confirmation that nobody in the world wanted the Jews. This is a myth. So I have research that actually disproves that. But what is true is that the St. Louis, because it was so prominent, eclipsed a lot of other fates of refugee ships. For instance, this is a ship, a much smaller ship that was organized and run by the secret Jewish refugee organization Aliyah Bet that operated in Eastern Europe, in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And most of those passengers, most of those refugees aimed to go to Palestine. As you can see from the image, the Parita, that's what the ship is called, is this miserable, really ill-equipped, very small and dirty steamship that was really never built for carrying passengers. And most of the Aliyah Bet ships were like that. And there is now a lot of research emerging about the dramatic nature of the fate of those ships. So compared to that, the St. Louis was a lot more glamorous, at least outwardly, and was bigger and built for carrying passengers and received the lion's share of attention. So here we also have a tension between visibility and invisibility that people might not expect when they think about this chapter. A lot of people think that the St. Louis was the only Jewish refugee ship. Well, far from it. So other aspects when it comes to visibility is how the passengers themselves try to control their image. If we go to some of the images, for instance, of them, here we have the board committee, which the captain formed after they learned that, after it was learned that Cuba was going to pose problems in accepting the passengers. And so Captain Schroeder formed a committee of these 7 men. Initially, it was only 5, and then on the return trip, added 2. So this is an image taken from photo from the return trip, who were all passengers and who were supposed to mediate between the passengers, the larger group of passengers, and the crew in terms of trying to calm them down, conveying to them what the situation was and what the intention of the captain is. This image, I think, is very interesting because it shows that the passengers had a degree of agency. They were able to control part of their fate, and they also spearheaded initiatives that made by which the passengers communicated to the press, especially the American press, their fate on board, and were able to strategically get the American press to be on their side. So there was a lot of sympathy from the American press about the St. Louis voyage, and prominent people in public life, like the actor Edward G. Robinson, for instance, the film producer Adolf Zukor, all sent telegrams and letters to President Roosevelt speaking on behalf of the passengers. We also have, let me see if I can find this really quickly. We have this image, which is a brilliant cartoon that was published in the Daily Mirror on June 6, where we see the St. Louis, here marked as Jewish refugee ship, going past the Statue of Liberty, which averts her eyes and has a sign that says "Keep out." So the press was very sympathetic to the St. Louis and tried to shape the discourse in the United States around their fate. We also have a number of images that show the passengers on board. This is one that's actually fairly well known. It comes up frequently in St. Louis memory culture. This is passenger Werner Lenneberg, who skates on deck of the St. Louis. One of the things that made the trip so bizarre was that passengers, when they left Hamburg, really believed themselves to be proper migrants. They knew they were forced to leave Germany. They had rescinded their German citizenship, and they knew that, this was all something that was not of their own choice. At the same time, they were paying passengers. They had a destination, so they thought. They firmly expected to be led into Cuba. And so the westbound crossing was not so different from a regular ocean liner crossing that you see tourists undertake. The whole thing changed with Cuba's rejection of them, and then the mood became a lot more desperate, and things, became a lot more dangerous for them. So the passengers always oscillated between being these glamorous cruise tourists, as we see here, at a party, an evening gala in the social hall of the ship, and being distraught and being told, "You're going back to Germany now," and then threatening mass suicide. So that's one of the fascinating aspects about this trip, that it oscillated between a sort of certain hope, and also this feeling of absolute fear of annihilation. So, those are some of the aspects that I cover. Images carry a lot of memory and meaning. Here we see Captain Gustav Schröder after the war, patrolling the burned out wreck of his ship, of the St. Louis, which after the trip was over was laid up in Hamburg, and was actually used as a makeshift hotel and restaurant in the late 40s. And he went and paid the ship several visits. And this image is from a popular magazine, from Revue. So the fate of the St. Louis and of the captain were also continued to be covered by the press after the war. So this is another interesting chapter in the discussion. And then finally, I want to show this image, which is an installation by the sculptor Daniel Liebeskind. It's called The Wheel of Conscience, and it is at the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21. And you see it's a very complex installation with multiple rotating discs, which I think can be seen here. And it's also part of St. Louis memory culture. So that's where I want to stop my sharing here. There's so much more to talk about, but in any case, I feel like it's so great to have this dialogue with you about
Yeah.
a lot of
Right.
these.
I have a question actually because one of the things when I was reading your book and looking at the images that struck me was that the whoever was taking the photograph was informing was making decisions based on what their intentions were. So I know that the press, became very engaged in photographing and reporting on the plight of the refugees on the St. Louis and had a certain story that they wanted to tell. And then there was like the institutional photographs that were taken by the company, the German company that owned the ship. Did you did when you were doing your research and finding these images, how did you have a look closely at, I'm sure you did. I know that you're a very thorough researcher. I'm sure you looked closely at who was taking the photographs and how that might have informed the perspective and the details included. If you could share a little about that, I'd love to hear.
Yeah. So what was interesting is that there's essentially two broad categories of photographs about the St. Louis passengers and the St. Louis. One is photographs taken by the press. And that process began when the St. Louis was anchored in Havana Harbor. And after the passengers learned that Cuba wasn't going to actually let them disembark. One of the passengers jumped ship. He was so distraught that he tried to commit suicide. He slid his wrists and just jumped into Havana Harbor. And that actually brought a lot of reporters on the scene. So when that happened, a lot of reporters in the US traveled to Cuba in order to cover the whole story. So the initial attention from the press, or by the press, was actually prompted by the passengers already. And then you get especially images of the St. Louis being in the harbor, being surrounded by little boats and dinghies with their relatives who were there and tried to be in touch with them. So we have those dramatic scenes covered by the press, and we get cartoons. But then the other category of photographs is by passengers who had cameras on board and basically photographed one another. So those were all amateur photographers. And there is a wealth of such photographs. And I've only shown you one or two. And they were eventually all given, a lot of them were given to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum because a lot of the estates of those passengers just were bequeathed to the museum when people passed on. And those are a lot more amateur type pictures. In some ways, they look a little bit like some of the pictures that you took, but yours, of course, are so much more carefully constructed and staged, whereas the ones of the passengers on deck are oftentimes snapshots or, fairly spontaneous, spur of the moment types
But
of images.
but to your point that they are coming from a similar place in the sense that the people being photographed do have more agency because they were being photographed by their loved ones. Something that I've been thinking a lot about is how these images kind of not just are while they're captured in the specific moment, they change over time. And I'm very aware when I'm, in the creation of this project that I, I am photographing these families in a very specific moment in time when they have a very specific story that they want to tell about their experience. And that as time passes, their story will evolve and change, and these images will have different meaning because they'll be commenting on, they'll be commenting on a specific moment in their time, and maybe, those details have shifted over time or the perspective has shifted. So I think it's really interesting that both you and I are kind of looking at imagery in terms of its power to not just comment on the moment, but change as, sort of shape our public understanding of history as it, after it has evolved or as it's evolving.
Yeah. I,
I'm sure the people looking at those photographs as the St. Louis was traveling saw them very differently than how we look at them today with the retrospective information, understanding what happened to the
That's
subject.
yeah, that's correct. There are some photographs, such as the image of the board committee, and another one that I didn't show, which is a photograph showing children from the St. Louis being in Westerbork camp in internment camp in Holland. And that picture was taken in 1941. Those pictures already, of course, were taken with the intent of documenting a kind of like a fate, a certain collective, a group of people at a moment in time. So there's a lot of intention behind those. The problem is that they still became superseded by time, even those images, in a way, because of what happened to the St. Louis. The board committee at the time of the taking of the photo didn't know how the whole trip would pan out. And the poignant one is the children in Westerbork, because they had already moved there, had been moved there as a result of the St. Louis having been rejected in the New World. They were interned in Westerbork, which was an internment camp set up by the Dutch government before the war, and it was turned into a deportation camp once the Nazis invaded Holland and became instrumentalized as a place from where a lot of people were then shipped off to the death camps east. And that is just completely devastating. You do not see that, of course, in the faces of those children because that part they weren't aware of just yet.
Yeah, I remember seeing that photograph of the in Havana Harbor of the boats with the fathers on who are waiting for their family members and trying to make contact with their family members. And I was just so struck by the how painful those photographs were, knowing what happened to the passengers, the context, looking at those photographs now in context, very different from how they were perceived, I'm sure, in the moment before people understood what was going to happen.
Yeah, and then
Um,
likewise, I mean, I think we should probably open it up
yes,
to
the
questions,
question.
but
Yes.
just my last point, likewise, I look at some of your photographs, I look at the subjects, and I feel like I want to see photographs of them earlier. What was
Yeah,
their life like before they got to the point where you photographed them, you know?
yeah, yeah. Yes. Well, I do actually, a few of the photographs do actually have photographs of the subjects in their younger, like that one of Akala, the woman from
Yeah.
Afghanistan, her as a young woman in Afghanistan. I really loved that she wanted to include that photograph because there's something very poignant about seeing her as a young woman in university, while at a time when women could be educated, and then what she went through after that.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah,
So,
let's open it up
yeah.
for questions.
Yes.
That sounds like a great idea.